women really had to make that choice whether they were going to leave their family, their community, and sometimes even their children behind and go to sea with their husband, or choose to stay on shore and possibly not see their husband for 3, 5, sometimes even 7 years.
Hi, welcome to SeaClass. I'm Krystal Rose, and I'm the Curator of Collections at Mystic Seaport Museum. Today, I am joined by Maria Petrillo, who is the Director of Historical Interpretation here at the museum, and we're going to be talking about women in whaling. Hi, Maria.
Hi.
Awesome. So, there's so many things to talk about when it comes to women in whaling. First of all, why were women even going to sea? I mean, and were women dressing up? Were they disguised as men and going to sea? What was the context?
Yeah, that's a really good question. We think of the maritime world as a very masculine space, and there were some women who dressed up as sailors and went to sea and worked as men on board, but that was pretty uncommon. There are a handful of historical examples of this that we can validate, but a lot of them become very mythic stories about,
Sure.
women following their sweethearts to sea. It was much more common for women to go to sea as captains' wives or as part of a captain's family, particularly on a whaling vessel where the captain often did have the permission to bring his family or his wife aboard.
Yeah, was that common to bring your wife on board?
By the second half of the 19th century, it was about a quarter of all whaling vessels had a woman or family on board.
Yeah.
Before that, it's not nearly as common.
Right, right. So why would women even choose to go to sea?
That's a great question. Early in the whale fishery, in the 18th century and the early 19th century, voyages were much shorter, maybe a year, maybe a little over a year. By the time you get to the 1830s and 40s, the average voyage is about 2 to 5 years. And so that's a really long separation that you're talking about from your family.
It's a really long time. Now, here at the museum, we have the Charles W. Morgan. It's the last wooden whaling ship in the world. Did women go to sea? Were there any whaling wives on the Morgan?
Yeah, there were. The Morgan is a delightfully typical whale ship of its time. And in fact, 5 different women went to sea on board the Charles W. Morgan. The first one was Lydia Goodspeed Lander. She went to sea in 1863. Then we have Mrs. Tinkham, Clara Tinkham. You can actually see her day cabin on board the vessel, so you can see what that was like. She went to sea in 1875 to 1876. Unfortunately, she was one of those people who never got over her seasickness, and she left the voyage early because she was just absolutely miserable for the whole time.
That would have been me. Yeah.
So after that, we have another woman, Mrs. Keith, who goes to sea. And interestingly, the only reason we know about her is because we have a logbook that mentions that she left the vessel. But she's nowhere in any of the other documentation. She's not on the crew list. She's not in any of the official documents. And I think that's a really interesting example of why it can be so hard to find these women sometimes.
Sure.
But we know that she left in 1883 with her husband and her son. So then we have Honor Earl. She's going to sea in the 1890s. She's actually a New Zealand school teacher, marries her husband in Hawaii, and then goes on several voyages with him, later bringing along their young son, whose, I think, recollections we have written down here in our collections here at Mystic Seaport, because he actually lived long enough to share those with us.
And photographs of them.
Yeah, and photographs
also.
as well. Great pictures of all of them on board.
Yeah.
And then the last woman we have going to sea is Lottie Church, or Charlotte Church, and she sails in the early 20th century, and she is one of the only women on the Morgan that's actually officially part of the crew. She is one of the navigators on board.
So Maria, speaking of Lottie Church and documents and journals and the way that we know about people who were on board whale ships, we actually have Lottie Church's journal here. And what's so cool about it is it has all the typical things you would expect in a logbook, which can be much drier than a journal. So it has the date, latitude, longitude, and notes about what happens during each day. But she also, because she was a navigator, there's a lot of mathematical figures that you see here as she's doing her calculations as a navigator.
Yeah, that is a lot of math done by hand.
Yeah.
So Krystal, I think logbooks, they're really interesting. They give us a lot of information, but they can be a little dry reading. But I think we have 2 journals here written by 2 different women. Can you tell me a little bit about these?
Yeah, so these are 2 of our most famous journals written by women on board whaling vessels. So in this particular journal, this is Mary Brewster. She kept this journal in the 1840s. She was a whaling wife out of Stonington, Connecticut.
Oh, wow.
And she sailed out on the ship Tiger with her husband. And many people are familiar. There's a publication of all of her journal entries, which is really quite wonderful. But this page in particular, Maria, where you just turned to, is kind of cool because, it's sad. In fact, this is actually her describing the loss of a crew member. There was a crew member who fell overboard and died. And so she describes it in great detail here. And it's quite heart-wrenching to read her description of it.
You can see she's even outlined the whole page.
Yeah.
Seems like to highlight it specifically from the other entries. And
Right.
I know in a logbook sometimes they don't even give you the story of how somebody died. They just mention that it happened. So having this is really, really fascinating.
What's interesting, especially too, about the tiger, is that there were 2 other people keeping journals on board also. And so it's interesting to hear about another person's description of the event. And in fact, one of the people keeping the journals was the person who died. And his journals, there's the thought that she probably hung on to them and read them, and there are pages missing, and you can't help but wonder about the missing pages.
What was on those pages?
yeah, so it's kind of interesting.
Yeah.
You know, one of the other things that we have related to Mary Brewster is we actually have a photograph of her, an early photograph. This is a daguerreotype, and
love that.
Yeah, the detail in it is really quite beautiful. To be able to see her facial features and her dress, and to be able to put, a face with the journal is really
incredible.
nice. Yeah.
And now I understand that in the 1840s, she would have been one of the earliest women to be going to sea on a whaling ship for that length of time. So it must have been really interesting for her, like probably not knowing many other people who had done this.
Yeah, and it's interesting, like many, women in whaling, she was very seasick.
Yeah.
And in fact, you don't hear from her for a long time in the beginning part of the voyage because she is so seasick, and she mentions it quite often. So it's kind of just like Mrs. Tinkham.
Yeah.
This was
never felt better.
Yeah, this was a normal thing. And she mentions too the crew being seasick on occasion, so it's really interesting. She also has a great log entry or journal entry where she describes when they have the 1,000th barrel of oil. They cook donuts in the Tri-Works.
I love that story.
Which is pretty cool.
Yeah.
Another, donuts in the Tri-Works happened on board the Ohio too.
Okay.
So I have another journal over here. This is a later journal. So 1840s is our friend Mary. 1870s is this woman, Sally Smith.
So she would have been going to sea when there were more women who were on whale ships. So this was a little bit less unusual when Sally's going to sea than when Mary's going to sea.
And in fact, she makes notes every time that they come into contact with other whaling vessels where there's a wife on board. Anytime they go into port, and she ends up having some sort of interaction with another whaling wife.
Pretty interesting social life if you think about it. Visiting people on board other whaling ships, visiting them in foreign ports, and having this whole community of, I think they call them sister sailors.
Yeah, definitely a community of sister sailors. With Sally, one of the things that is so special about her logbook and her story is that not only do we have the logbook, right, and we have her logbook, very different than Mary's. She is quite bored and writes about it daily, how bored she is, to see a whale. She mentions many times, especially in the beginning of the voyage, she does mention seasickness. She does a lot of sewing and knitting.
Yeah.
She, like Mary, is also very close with her husband, and her husband is engaged in making lots of scrimshaw, especially later on in the voyage. So what's awesome is that with her journal, we have all of these beautiful objects, probably a couple dozen objects or more to go along with the story. We also have his logbook. So it's interesting to compare her journal with his logbook on the same date. And I actually have some of the things that are from the Smiths.
Wow.
So Sally Smith, her husband, Frederick Howland Smith, made some of these pieces.
They're beautiful.
Yeah, and they're actually both featured here. They're both in this really intricate, this is a framed image, or it's a combined tintypes and ambrotypes of the Smith family. And right here, kind of in the center, is Frederick Howland Smith, and then up here in the top right, this is Sally. So this is our journal keeper. And the pieces, I picked out just a few pieces to show. I mean, Fred was really, I say this like I know him, but Captain Smith was really quite talented.
Yeah.
And I can't help but think, because there are a couple of places in the logbook where Sally mentions helping Fred make a box today.
So she might have been making some of this.
She might have been making some of this. She also mentions she's helping him to make crochet hooks, which I have here. She even says that he's learning to knit in a few places throughout. So we have some of her lovely things here.
A lot of sailors actually learn how to knit, which I always think is so interesting because we think of it as more of a women's domestic, task. But if you're at sea and you don't have your wife with you and you need to make something, guess who's making it? You've got to learn how to knit and how to sew. But I also think, talking about the boredom, most women, when you read their journals, the drudgery and the repetition and the fact that they're really isolated.
Very isolated.
They're not calling on friends. They're not visiting with family.
But they're writing letters.
But they're writing a lot of letters
and receiving letters. Yep.
But they're, their day to day, like they are often really cut off from that community. So putting your time into creative endeavors like this, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
And it's a beautiful piece.
Yeah, every piece that we have from the Smith family is so interesting. Another fun little piece about the Smiths is they use this red sealing wax on practically like half of the pieces. There are some other pieces. We have little bottles of oil with the red sealing wax. It's on the needles. It's clumped on the bottom of some pieces accidentally.
They must have had a lot of it somewhere.
Yeah, anytime I see the red sealing wax, I think it's probably an object from the Smiths, which is kind of nice.
So the next thing I'd love to talk about are these amazing photographs.
Yeah.
Now, we use these on campus a lot when we talk about cutting in, about the process of cutting into and trying out a whale. And they're really incredible photos, but I think the really incredible thing about them is that they were actually taken by a woman, correct?
They were, yeah, Marion Shaw Smith. And Marion Shaw Smith apparently went on more whaling voyages than any whaling wife.
Wow.
And she took these photographs that we have, and they're actually they're all over the place. You see these photographs. They're in other museums. They were turned into postcards. She was making these on the whale ship California in the early 1900s, about 1901, I think is the year that she's taking these photographs. And they're so, she's clearly right in the middle of the action in a lot of these photographs, which is great. Yeah.
I mean, she must be on a whaling boat or something off to the side of the ship to get this angle.
Yeah. And many of them were turned into postcards, for which she never even got any credit. So only recently here have they been properly attributed to her in our collection.
Wow.
She's another great, really great story.
And what an interesting way to document your time at sea. We're so used to seeing journals and logbooks, but to have photographs taken literally from a woman's perspective is really incredible.
Yeah. So Maria, we've talked about women on board whale ships, these whaling wives, these sister sailors, but in reality, most women did not go to sea. So what were most women back home doing during this time?
That's a great question. Whale ships are only a small part of a really large industry, the overall industry of whaling.
Right.
And to your point, most women don't get a chance to go to sea. Either they choose not to, or if you're not a captain's wife, you often just don't have that option. So you are staying on shore, whether you want to or not. And in that case, what women are doing is they're basically holding the industry and the community on shore together.
Right.
When you think about men going to sea for years at a time, you have to have somebody back on shore kind of keeping it all, in hand. And so women are running businesses. Right. They are investing money, often on their husband's behalf. They are managing children's education. They're traveling. They're visiting with each other. And early feminists and early suffragettes are actually using whaling women as one of the examples as to why they think women can and should have the vote. But it's interesting because at the same time, you have these women who are choosing to go to sea, who are really longing for that domestic comfort, that domestic life, but for the most part, that's not the experience that they get to have because the industry, the maritime industry, just requires that separation most of the time.
How did women who did stay at home, how did they view women who chose to go to sea? and vice versa? How did that?
It's so varied, but I think it changes over time, like anything. So
Right.
Mary Brewster, whose journal we looked at, she's one
Right.
of the first women going to sea. She's not the first, but she's pretty close.
She's an early.
Yeah, she's an early trailblazer, and I think she gets a lot of pushback based on her letters and her
Right.
correspondence with family. Later on, it becomes a much more common thing, and
Right.
so while it's still a pretty big decision to choose to go and kind of isolate yourself on a whale ship for 3 to
Right.
5 years, it's a much more common decision. And you see that as more women start to go to sea, even on the Morgan, we see a lot more
Yeah.
women later in
Right.
the ship's career than earlier. And I think that, it also just depends a lot on that particular woman's experience, whether or not
Sure.
she likes it. Some women seem to really enjoy it. So Honor Earl, for
Mary,
example,
yeah,
Mary Brewster.
also, she really enjoyed it, and
Yeah.
she really loved being with her husband,
Yes.
and that's very clear when you
Yes.
read her entries.
And then there are women like Mrs. Tinkham, who's just miserable the whole time and can't
Right.
wait to get off of that whale ship. And actually, at the end of that voyage, her husband stops going to sea as well.
Yeah.
They moved to a farm. So obviously, that wasn't for her.
Yeah. So we've been looking at these women's logbooks, but there are actually lots of men keeping journals also. And do they ever write about the women? Do they ever write about the captain's wife?
They do. So all the way from owners down to your average sailor, they all have an opinion. So Charles W. Morgan, the namesake of the Charles W. Morgan here at Mystic Seaport Museum, he thought having women on board was a great idea. He thought it was a civilizing influence. He thought it would make the captains happier and therefore more profitable.
Yeah.
Other owners straight up refused to give permission. So you read a lot of women's journals and letters where they're talking about wanting to go to sea and then not being able to because the owners don't say okay, they don't give them permission. And then you also have sailors' letters writing about women on board, and it's very mixed. So some sailors like it. They also feel like it's a civilizing influence. It makes them feel a little bit more like they're at home.
Sure.
And other sailors have some very unpleasant things to say about the women who are
Yeah.
on board. They resent their presence, they resent the space they take up, and they resent their impact on the whaling experience overall.
Sure. Although
Particularly,
sometimes they're actually helping to take care of some of the crew
Yes.
members when illness strikes the vessel. So,
Yes.
so yeah, it's kind of a mixed.
yes, I imagine if you are ill on board a whaling ship, it's probably really helpful to have
Right.
another person there to sort of take care of you.
Right.
But
What about
not
children
everybody
on
liked it.
board? We have a great example of that on the Charles W.
Yes.
Morgan. We have little Jamie Earl, who was on board the Morgan. But are there any stories from them or any other examples that come to mind for you?
There are. The Williams family, which is Mrs. Williams, is another woman who wrote a journal about her time at sea, I think leading up to 1869 to 71. And she has 3 different children who go to sea with her over the years, including her teenage son, who is actually the one who ends up editing her journals for publication and then adding his own memoirs as
Right.
well. It seems that, children were pretty adaptable, and for the most part, living on board was kind of natural for them, particularly if they were born while they were at sea.
Yeah.
So that does happen. You have women who are putting into port because they are giving birth, and then a few weeks later, they're getting right back
They're
on a
right
whale
back
ship
on.
and
Yeah.
back out to the whaling grounds.
Yeah.
And there's some very funny stories about little kids who have been on a whale ship so much that when they get on shore, they start crying because it's so unfamiliar to
It's so
them.
different,
They're just
yeah.
so used to being on board
Yeah.
a whale ship.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there's also loss at sea too.
Yes.
We have the story of the Landers family who
Yes.
experienced losing a son at sea.
Yes,
Yeah.
and it's sadly very common.
Yeah.
You're very far away from medical help, and of course, the dangers of being at sea mean that your risks are a lot higher.
Right. Maria, thank you so much for joining me and sharing your incredible knowledge about the subject matter and looking at all these wonderful artifacts from our collection.
Thank you so much for having me. It was incredible to get to come and look at all of these different artifacts in our collections.
Excellent. Thank you for joining us for this episode of SeaClass. We hope that you enjoyed learning about women in whaling.